Your brain is designed to never be satisfied. The Buddha found the exit. The meeting point. Episode 4. The meeting point. Episode 4. Science looks outward. It builds instruments. It maps territories. The first 3 episodes of this series followed that outward gaze. How reality is constructed. How nothing lasts. How nothing exists alone. Today, we turn inward. Today, we look at the one mechanism that every one of us has been running for our entire adult lives. The one we notice least. The one that keeps us reaching for the next meal, the next promotion, the next holiday, the next version of a life that always seems to be about to arrive. And we place that mechanism next to a diagnosis the Buddha made 25 centuries ago, in language so precise that modern neuroscience, trying to describe the same mechanism from the outside, keeps running into him again and again. In 1978, 3 psychologists interviewed 22 people who had just won major lottery jackpots. They also interviewed 22 of their neighbors, people chosen almost at random from the phone book, and 29 people who, in the same period, had become paraplegic or quadriplegic through catastrophic accidents. 3 groups. One at the top of an arc most of us only dream about. One at the bottom of a fall most of us dread. One in the middle, the ordinary neighbors, living ordinary lives. Brickman, Coates, and Janoff-Bullman asked each group the same set of questions. How happy are you right now? How happy do you expect to be 2 years from now? And then, this is the part that matters. How much pleasure do you take in ordinary things? Talking with a friend, watching television, eating breakfast, hearing a joke, getting a compliment from someone you respect, reading a magazine, buying clothes. The lottery winners, these people who had, in one single moment, received the thing most of us spend our lives working toward, took significantly less pleasure in those ordinary activities than their neighbors did. I want to pause here, because this study is one of the most cited and one of the most misrepresented pieces of research in modern psychology. And I made a promise at the end of the last episode that I would be honest with you about the data. So, the study was small, 22 lottery winners, interviewed once, not followed over time. The claim you may have heard, that happiness returns to its old baseline within a year, is not what Brickman actually measured. He couldn't measure it. He interviewed each person one time. Brickman and his colleagues themselves wrote, at the end of their paper, that the finding called for a larger, longitudinal study. That study came later, or rather, many of them came later. The German socio-economic panel followed over 24,000 people across 15 years. Richard Lucas and Ed Diener tracked major life events across decades, and the core finding held, with important nuance. We adapt, partly, to good fortune and to bad. Some events produce lasting shifts. Unemployment does. Widowhood does. Disability does. Others, a promotion, a windfall, a new car, a new house, lose their ability to move us more quickly than we ever expect they will. What Brickman and Donald Campbell had named 7 years earlier, in 1971, they called the hedonic treadmill. The idea that we keep chasing and acquiring, and each acquisition returns us to roughly where we started, already reaching for the next thing. If this were only a personal problem, it would be manageable. It isn't. In 1974, the economist Richard Easterlin noticed something strange at the scale of entire nations. As countries grew richer, and in the middle of the 20th century, many were growing quickly, their average self-reported happiness barely moved. Real incomes in the United States roughly doubled between 1946 and 1970. average happiness across that span was essentially flat. The finding came to be called the Easterlin Paradox, and economists have been arguing about it ever since. I want to be careful here, because the picture in 2026 is more nuanced than the original claim. Richer countries are, on average, happier than poorer countries. Money does help, especially when it lifts people out of real hardship. Lifting a family out of food insecurity, out of housing precarity, out of medical fear, that is genuine relief, and it shows up clearly in the data. But each additional dollar stacked on top of what came before buys less happiness than the one before it. And above a certain level, the exact threshold is contested, somewhere in the range of $100,000 a year in the United States. Money simply stops fixing the deepest sources of misery: heartbreak, grief, depression, the things money was never going to reach in the first place. So here is the pattern, and I want you to feel the shape of it. An individual wins the lottery, and within a year is reaching for something else. A nation grows rich, and average happiness barely moves. A person spends a lifetime acquiring, and keeps reaching. Something in the architecture of wanting itself is the problem. Not the objects, not the circumstances, not the specific thing you thought would finally be enough. The wanting. And in 1989, a neuroscientist at the University of Michigan, quite by accident, while running an experiment designed to answer a completely different question, began to see inside that architecture. What he found is now one of the most important shifts in how we understand desire. And it maps with unsettling precision onto a diagnosis the Buddha made 2,500 years before the first MRI scanner was ever built. Act 1. The Science. The neuroscientist was Kent Berridge. In 2024, he was elected to the National Academy of Sciences. But in the late 1980s, he was an early career researcher in the psychology department at the University of Michigan, and he was trying to settle a question everyone assumed was already settled. The question was, what does dopamine do? The answer, by consensus, the answer in every textbook, in every popular article, in every conversation about the brain, was clear. Dopamine was the pleasure chemical. The circuit that runs from the midbrain up into a small structure called the nucleus accumbens had been named, decades earlier, the reward pathway. It had a famous origin story. In 1954, two researchers at McGill University, James Olds and Peter Milner, implanted electrodes into the brains of rats and gave the rats a lever they could press to stimulate their own brains. The rats pressed the lever until they collapsed. They would choose it over food, over sleep, over a willing mate. The circuit had been identified. The reward center of the brain had been found. And when later research showed that this circuit ran on dopamine, the conclusion seemed inescapable. Dopamine was what it felt like to feel good. Drugs that amplified dopamine, cocaine, amphetamines, produced intense pleasure. Drugs that blocked dopamine flattened everything. The picture was clean, elegant. For 30 years, every introductory neuroscience textbook said the same thing, and it was about to turn out to be wrong. Berridge was running an experiment on rats. He was not trying to overturn the consensus. He was investigating a narrower question about feeding behavior. He used a neurotoxin, 6-hydroxydopamine, to destroy the rat's dopamine neurons almost entirely. The prediction, based on everything the field had assumed for 30 years, was clear. Without dopamine, these rats should experience no pleasure. They should show no interest in food, and, crucially, when sweet liquid was placed directly on their tongues, they should show none of the facial expressions that, in rodents, indicate hedonic response. The rhythmic tongue protrusions, the lateral licks, the paw movements that reliably track what researchers call liking. The rats did stop seeking food. Without dopamine, they stopped pursuing every reward. They sat still. They wouldn't work for sugar. They wouldn't work for anything. Left to themselves, they would have starved. That part fit the prediction. But when sweet liquid was placed directly on their tongues, they made the pleasure face. All of it. The rhythmic tongue protrusions, the lateral licks, the paw movements, every measurable indicator of what, in a rat, liking looks like, completely, unmistakably intact. The rats couldn't be bothered to want the sugar, but when the sugar arrived in their mouths, they still liked it every bit as much as they ever had. Something was wrong with the consensus. Dopamine, it turned out, was not the pleasure chemical. It was the wanting chemical. And wanting and liking, Berridge realized over the next decade of careful work, are two different systems in the brain. Almost completely separable, anatomically distinct, chemically distinct, functionally distinct. The wanting system is the one you know. You know it without needing a neuroscientist to describe it. It is driven by dopamine, originating in a small region of the midbrain called the ventral tegmental area, projecting forward into the nucleus accumbens, and from there across a wide network of the brain. It is what makes you pursue, reach, scroll, refresh. Open the refrigerator at 11 at night and stand there looking for something you cannot name. It is what makes a gambler place another bet after the pleasure of winning stopped being pleasurable 3 hours ago. It is what makes an addict crave a substance they no longer even enjoy. The wanting system is vast. It is robust. It is engineered by natural selection over hundreds of millions of years to never, ever stop. Because an organism that stops wanting, stops eating, stops mating, stops pursuing, does not leave descendants. The liking system is different. It is smaller, much smaller. Berridge and his colleagues identified specific regions, clusters of neurons, actually, that generate the pleasure itself. He calls them hedonic hotspots. They run on different neurotransmitters, opioids, endocannabinoids, orexin, not dopamine, and the hotspots are tiny. In a rat brain, each one is about a cubic millimeter in volume. In a human brain, perhaps a cubic centimeter, roughly the size of a sugar cube, embedded in a structure built for a completely different purpose. Fragile, easily disrupted. There is one hotspot inside the nucleus accumbens, the same structure that gets flooded by dopamine during wanting. But the hotspot only occupies about 10% of its volume. The other 90% drives wanting and cannot enhance liking no matter how hard it fires. There is another hotspot in a structure called the ventral pallidum, and this one has an unsettling property. If you damage it, even slightly, sweet taste stops being pleasant. It becomes disgusting. Rats given sugar water after a small lesion in the ventral pallidum make the same facial expressions they would make if given something bitter. The pleasure doesn't just fade, it inverts. Berridge summed up the general situation in a 2016 paper in the journal American Psychologist. I want to give you his exact words because they matter. Quote, "Intense pleasures are relatively few and far between in life, compared with intense desires." End quote. That is a peer-reviewed scientist, writing for other peer-reviewed scientists, about rats and fMRI scans and Parkinson's patients. He is not making a spiritual argument. He is describing what the brain, as a matter of measurable architecture, actually is. I should be straight about the limits of this research. The strongest evidence for the wanting-liking dissociation comes from animal studies. The rat work Berridge has spent 40 years refining. In humans, the picture is growing, but it is not as bulletproof as the rodent data. Brain imaging shows that dopamine-related activity correlates more tightly with ratings of wanting than with ratings of liking. Addiction research shows people who keep using substances long after those substances stopped producing any real pleasure. Heroin users who describe the drug in interviews as a joyless compulsion they cannot escape. And Parkinson's disease provides some of the most striking evidence. A meaningful percentage of Parkinson's patients on dopamine replacement medication develop impulse control disorders, compulsive gambling, compulsive shopping, binge eating, hypersexuality, without reporting any increase in actual pleasure from any of those activities. They want more. They like the same. The medication is turning up the wanting volume while leaving the liking channel untouched. The patient can see what is happening. The patient often cannot stop. But the human evidence, as I said, is growing, not finished. I want you to hold it that way. And now, if you are tracking with me, you have already noticed something. The architecture Kent Berridge spent 40 years mapping, a vast, structurally insatiable wanting system, coupled to a tiny, fragile liking system that it perpetually outruns, rhymes almost exactly with what the Buddha, in his very first recorded teaching after awakening, called the origin of suffering. I want to be clear about what I am claiming and what I am not. This parallel is my synthesis, not Berridge's. In his scientific writing, he has not drawn the connection to Buddhist psychology. The bridge is ours to build. But the architecture rhymes so precisely that it is difficult, once you see it, not to. Before we cross that bridge, there is one more piece of the science worth naming, because it sharpens the picture. In 1974, the psychologist Richard Solomon proposed what he called opponent process theory. Every emotionally significant experience, he said, triggers two processes in the nervous system. A primary response, the pleasure of the drug, the thrill of the jump, the joy of the reward, and an opposing response, the crash, the flatness, the withdrawal. At first, the primary process dominates, but with repetition, the opposing process grows. It starts sooner, it lasts longer, it becomes stronger. The result, at the behavioral level, is that the original pleasure shrinks and the counter-pressure expands into the space where the pleasure used to be. Solomon studied two populations carefully, parachutists and drug users. A first-time skydiver experienced terror during the jump and mild, short-lived relief afterward. A veteran of 100 jumps experienced manageable fear during the jump and hours of exhilaration afterward. The pleasure had migrated. The initial experience had weakened. The compensatory process had grown into the dominant feeling, and the drug data looked exactly the same, in reverse. First use, enormous euphoria, small crash. 100th use, modest euphoria, devastating crash. Both cases, the same architecture. The primary response shrinks. The counter-pressure grows. Modern neuroscientists have taken Solomon's framework and mapped it onto actual brain circuits, stress systems in the extended amygdala, involving neurotransmitters like CRF and dynorphin. The theory has been renamed, extended, argued about, but the core insight has held up remarkably well. Pleasures generate counter-pressure. The counter-pressure grows with use. You need more to feel the same, and eventually you need something just to feel normal. This is not identical to what the Buddha meant by taṇhā, but it rhymes with it. And again, I want to be careful. This is a parallel many writers have drawn. It is not, in peer-reviewed neuroscience, a stated scientific finding. It is ours to notice. So let us notice what we have. A wanting system far larger than the liking system. A hedonic architecture that generates counterpressure with use. A hedonic treadmill at the individual level. An Easterlin paradox at the civilizational level. And a cellular story at the level of the brain that explains, as well as anything has explained it, why the other two patterns exist. The neuroscience describes the architecture with great precision. Every year, it describes it in more detail. What it cannot tell you is what to do with it. There is no pill that enlarges the hedonic hotspots. There is no surgery that removes taṇhā. There is no cleverly designed incentive structure, no app, no diet, no social reform, no self-help program that will fix a mechanism built into the architecture of the brain by natural selection over hundreds of millions of years. Science has mapped the treadmill with beautiful precision. It cannot tell you how to step off, and this is where the Buddha begins. Act 2. The Buddhist Teaching. Before we name what the Buddha taught, consider what he refused. One day, the texts say, SN 420, the Buddha was sitting alone in the Himalayas, and a thought arose in him. Not a thought about escape, a thought about engagement. Could someone, he wondered, exercise rulership righteously, without killing, without causing others to kill, without dispossessing anyone of what was theirs? Could power be wielded, for once in the actual history of the world, without the suffering that power seems to require? Mara appeared immediately. Mara, the Buddhist figure of temptation, the force in the mind that draws you back toward becoming. And Mara's pitch was surprisingly sophisticated. He did not offer the Buddha wealth for personal indulgence. He did not offer palaces or women or status or any of the standard enticements. He said, "You have developed your powers to the point where you could literally turn the Himalayan range, king of mountains, into solid gold. Use it. Fix the world. Become the righteous king no one else has ever been." The Buddha's answer, in verse, is the cleanest statement of the treadmill in the Pali Canon. He said that even a mountain of gold, of solid bullion, doubled. Even twice that wouldn't suffice for one person. Knowing this, he said, one should train to let go of acquisition, recognizing it for what it is. Not freedom, but a bond. I want you to sit with that for a moment. The Buddha is not refusing a sinful offer. He is refusing a virtuous one. Mara is not tempting him to cruelty. Mara is tempting him to benevolent rulership, backed by infinite resources, in service of the world. The Buddha refuses. Because the treadmill, he understands, is still a treadmill even when the prize is righteous rule. And acquisition is a bond, even when what you acquire is the power to help. When the Buddha gave his first teaching, a few weeks after awakening, he went looking for the 5 ascetics who had been his companions during the years of extreme austerity. He found them at a deer park near Varanasi. They had written him off, thought he had abandoned the path when he broke his fast. But he sat down and he laid out, for the first time in the history of the tradition, the 4 noble truths, SN 5611, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. And in that first teaching, he named the origin of suffering with one precise Pali word. Not wrong action alone, not ignorance alone. Taṇhā, literally, thirst, craving. And he did not leave the word vague. He defined it with a phrase that modern neuroscience, without ever reading a word of Pali, keeps rediscovering in its own laboratories. The translator Thanissaro Bhikkhu renders the Buddha's definition this way: it is the craving that perpetuates further becoming, and then, here's the phrase I want you to hold, accompanied by passion and delight, relishing now, here and now, there. 3 forms, the Buddha specifies: craving for sensuality, craving for becoming, craving for non-becoming. 3 faces of the same thirst. One brief note on translation. Thanissaro consistently translates the Pali word dukkha as stress, rather than the more common suffering. That is his interpretive choice, and I use it here because the channel follows his translation. But when you hear him say stress, read it as dukkha, a word that points to something wider than agony, not just the great sufferings, but the faint structural disquiet that runs underneath even pleasant experience. That is what the Buddha is pointing at, and taṇhā, he is saying, is its origin. Let us look at the 3 forms, one at a time from the inside. Kama taṇhā, craving for sensuality. This is the one most people think of first when they hear the word craving. But the Buddha's pointing is more precise than pleasure-seeking. As Thanissaro observes in his translator's notes, Kama taṇhā is not so much for things out there as it is for our plans for things out there. It is the compulsive embroidery of the mind around pleasures you have already had or hope to have again. Sit down to dinner and notice. Before the first bite, the mind is already planning what comes after. The anticipation of the dessert, the drink, the show tonight, tomorrow's breakfast. The craving is not really for what is in front of you. It is for the fantasy the mind keeps stitching together from pleasures it has tasted before. That compulsive embroidery, that relishing now, here and now there, is kama taṇhā, bhava taṇhā, craving for becoming. This one is subtler. It is the wanting to be somebody, to take on a particular identity within a particular world. Imagine you are 62 and you cannot stop rehearsing the version of yourself you want other people to see. The accomplished one, the good grandfather, the man who has aged with grace. Every thought is auditioning for a role in a world you are building in your head. That wanting to be somebody somewhere, that is bhava taṇhā, and it never resolves, because every identity you finish building starts decaying the moment you step inside it. Vibhava taṇhā, craving for non-becoming. This is the one that surprises people. Imagine you are 68, your knee hurts every morning, and sometimes, not often, but sometimes, a thought comes in. You just don't want to be in this anymore. Not wanting to harm yourself, just wanting the whole story to stop. The Buddha had a name for that, Vibhava taṇhā, the thirst for non-becoming. It is not weakness. It is the third face of the same thirst. But his teaching here is unusual, and I want you to catch it. Even this wanting to disappear is still a form of craving. It still makes for further becoming, and it cannot deliver the peace it promises. Because the peace it promises is a peace after something, and after something is still becoming, still the treadmill, running toward its own off switch. 3 faces, 1 architecture, all built on the same loop Berridge watched in his Rats, wanting that perpetually outruns what it gets. And here we have to pause, because the second noble truth requires a clarification that most introductions to Buddhism skip. And if I do not stop now and make it, this entire video can be misheard in a way that has caused real damage to people trying to practice. The Buddha did not say that all desire is wrong. The Pali word he named as the cause of suffering is taṇhā, this specific, compulsive, relishing thirst. But there is another word in the Pali, Chanda, usually translated as desire or aspiration or motivation. And the Buddha explicitly affirmed Chanda. He built it into the path itself. Chanda is the first of what the tradition calls the 4 bases of spiritual power. It drives right effort, the 6th step of the Eightfold Path. When the Buddha describes a monk exerting himself, he uses the formula, generates desire, endeavors, arouses persistence. The desire there is Chanda. The aim of awakening is a desire. The motivation to practice is a desire. The very movement toward the end of suffering is carried by desire. Thanissaro puts it this way: the path to nirvana is rooted in desire, in skillful desires. That is his exact phrasing. The Buddha did not want you to stop wanting. He wanted you to stop wanting the things that perpetuate suffering and to start wanting the thing that ends it. One of his disciples, Ananda, once had exactly this conversation with a Brahmin named Unaba, SN 5115. Ananda said the holy life was lived with the aim of abandoning desire. Unaba objected immediately. That, he said, is a paradox. You are using desire to abandon desire. How can that possibly work? Ananda gave a beautifully ordinary answer. It is, he said, like the desire to go to the park. You feel the desire. It moves you. You set out. You arrive at the park, and the desire is gone. It has been used up by reaching what it wanted. The desire for awakening, Ananda said, works the same way. It burns itself clean on arrival. One technical caveat, because this matters for reading the canon accurately. In that same conversation, the Pali word for both the desire to be abandoned and the desire as means is, in fact, Chanda. So, Chanda is not magically different from taṇhā as a matter of vocabulary. The sharper, cleaner contrast at the lexical level is between taṇhā, which the Buddha always treats as problematic, and Chanda, which takes its color from context. Skillful or unskillful is determined by what the desire is aimed at, and whether it consumes itself on arrival or keeps reaching for more. So hold this, because we will need it. The diagnosis is not stop wanting. The diagnosis is see what you are wanting, and see whether the wanting resolves when you get it, or whether it keeps reaching. If it keeps reaching, if it is accompanied by passion and delight, relishing now here and now there, that is taṇhā. And that is what the path is trying to bring to an end. In January of 2026, Thanissaro Bhikkhu published a short essay titled "To Feed is to Suffer." In it, he reconstructs the Buddha's oldest image for how suffering actually works. It is not a wheel, it is a feeding relationship, all the way down. To be what the Pali calls a satta, a being, is, in the Buddha's analysis, to need to feed. To be caught in passion and delight around the 5 components of experience, what the tradition calls the 5 aggregates, is to need to feed on them. And the word the Buddha uses for clinging, upadana, can also mean sustenance, fuel, the act of taking food. The reversal Thanissaro draws our attention to is this. The Upanishadic tradition that the Buddha grew up inside said, food is Brahman. To eat was to participate in the immortal. The Buddha took that feeding image and turned it upside down. To feed, he said, is not to become immortal. To feed is to suffer. Because what you feed on does not sustain you without cost. Thanissaro puts the reversal in one line. The things you try to feed on are actually chewing you up. The lottery winner is feeding on the win, and the feeding is eroding the pleasure of the win. The brain is feeding on dopamine, and the dopamine system is demanding more dopamine. The life is feeding on experiences, and each experience loses its taste as soon as it becomes food. This is not a moral failing. It is the architecture of what it is to be a being. And the Buddha's path, Thanissaro argues, is not to starve. The Buddha tried starvation in the years of extreme austerity, and it failed. The path is to feed the mind differently, to feed it on the factors of the path, on concentration, on insight, until the mind no longer needs the food that was chewing it up. Which brings us, finally, to the image the Buddha gave in the Magandiya Sutta, MN 75, when he wanted to show people what it actually looks like from the outside to be caught in taṇhā. Picture a man, a leper. His body is covered with sores and infections. The worms of the disease have eaten into him. The sores burn constantly. And what does he do? He scratches the sores with his fingernails, and he sits close, very close, to a pit of glowing embers, a charcoal pit, and he holds his burning skin over the heat. The fire feels good to him. The scratching feels good to him. Each action is deepening the wound, but in his condition, it registers as relief. His senses have been damaged by the disease itself. His perception is broken. The thing that is damaging him feels, to him, like the thing that is healing him. Then a doctor comes, and the doctor cures him. The sores close, the nerves heal. His senses return to normal function. He is, in the Buddha's telling, healed. He is at ease. He is free. Now, and this is the key turn, the healed man walks past the charcoal pit, and he sees another leper there, scratching, burning himself, pressing closer to the fire. Does he envy him? The question itself sounds absurd once it has been asked. Of course he does not envy him. He remembers what that felt like from the inside, and he remembers that what felt like pleasure was damage. But there is one more beat to the story, and it is the hardest one. Imagine two strong men come. They grab the healed man by the arms, and they try to drag him back toward the charcoal pit. The Buddha says he twists and pulls and fights them off. Because now, with his nervous system intact, the pit is not attractive. It is painful. The heat burns. The fire is something to move away from, not toward. The stimulus has not changed. The sensation has not changed. What has changed is the perception. He is no longer impaired. And with clear perception, the appeal of the whole system simply vanishes. This, the Buddha is saying, is what the ending of taṇhā looks like from the inside. Not willpower against a pleasure that is still pulling you. Not gritted teeth. Not suppression. A reorganization of perception such that the pull is no longer there. And he speaks from his own experience. Before he left home, the Buddha had 3 palaces, one for each season of the year, and every indulgence available to a prince. He ate from all of it, and he describes the shift after awakening in a phrase that, more than any other in the canon, names the end state the entire path is aimed at. He was, he said, free from thirst, my mind inwardly at peace. Free from thirst, not with thirst under better control, not with thirst redirected toward more sophisticated objects, not with thirst managed through willpower and good habits. Free from thirst. Act 3. Convergence. Let us put them side by side now. What the neuroscience showed us, and what the Buddha taught. Science, a vast wanting system, structurally engineered to never stop. A tiny liking system, fragile, easily exhausted. Pleasures that trigger counter-pressure that grows with use. At the individual level, a hedonic treadmill. At the civilizational level, the Easterlin Paradox. At the cellular level, a dopamine system firing into hedonic hotspots the size of sugar cubes, generating a wanting that always runs ahead of its own satisfaction. The Buddha, taṇhā, the craving that perpetuates further becoming, running on passion and delight, seeking relief now in one object, now in another. Three faces, sensuality, becoming, non-becoming, all built on the same loop. A wanting that outruns its own getting. A thirst that cannot be quenched by its object, because drinking is what makes it stronger. Look at the architecture. The wanting system fires before the liking system ever engages. Dopamine drives the seeking. And the moment of actual satisfaction, the brief firing of the cubic millimeter hotspot, is already being eroded by the wanting system's next surge. The leper is scratching. The scratching is deepening the wound, and the damage registers to the impaired senses as relief. This is what the Buddha called taṇhā, not because he had fMRI machines, not because he had a population of Parkinson's patients or a longitudinal panel of German households, but because he observed the same structure from the inside, with whatever equipment a human sitting still in a forest for years actually has, and then went somewhere science cannot follow. Because here's the crucial turn, and I want you to slow down with me for it. Science describes the architecture. Every year, it describes the architecture in more detail. What it cannot tell you is what to do about it. The Buddha's third noble truth, SN 5611, does not describe. It claims. It claims that taṇhā has an end, not a management, not a redirection, not a sublimation, an end. The Pali word for what he describes is nirodha, cessation. I want to be careful with the treadmill image here, because I have been using it throughout this episode. The treadmill is my metaphor, not the canonical one. The Buddha did not talk about stepping off a machine. The canonical formulation, in the translation this channel follows, describes a disappearance of craving that leaves nothing behind. A total release from the thirst that was driving the system. So hold the treadmill as a pointer, not as scripture. The underlying logic, though, is canonical. And the logic is this: taṇhā does not end by being suppressed. It does not end by being willed away. It does not end by being replaced with better behaved cravings. It ends by being seen so clearly that it loses its grip. Dispassion, in the Pali viraga, is not a feeling you cultivate by effort. It is what arises in the mind when the craving is finally seen through. When the leper understands, from a position of healed senses, what the scratching is actually doing. When the gambler sees, without the pull, what the next bet is actually buying. When the mind sees the loop, sees itself running the loop, and sees that the loop cannot, structurally cannot, deliver what the loop is promising. When dispassion arises, craving falls away, not because we forced it down, because we stopped feeding it. One contemporary neuroscientist has taken this claim seriously as a clinical hypothesis. His name is Judson Brewer. He teaches at Brown University. He has spent his career mapping craving loops onto Buddhist psychology and designing interventions based directly on the second noble truth. His apps, Craving to Quit, Eat Right Now, Unwinding Anxiety, teach people to notice the craving, notice the dissatisfaction the craving is actually delivering, and in that seeing, let the loop's grip loosen. It is the most direct clinical attempt I know of to apply the Buddha's diagnosis in modern evidence-based practice. And it has real, measurable results. Smokers quit, anxiety eases, binge eating patterns shift, but And this matters for what the Buddha was actually claiming. Even Brewer's approach stops short of what the Pali texts mean by nirodha. His aim is symptom relief, better regulation, a saner relationship with craving. I do not think he would claim his work produces the complete ending that the Third Noble Truth describes. There is a gap, in other words, between manage the craving and the craving ceases, between live better with the loop and the loop stops running, between scratch less and no longer need to scratch. Science, at its most integrated with Buddhist practice, Brewer's work, Kabat-Zinn's mindfulness research, the whole field of contemplative neuroscience, operates in the first gap, skillfully, usefully, sometimes beautifully. The Third Noble Truth claims the second, and the path to that second claim, the complete path in all its detail, is what the Buddha called the Fourth Noble Truth, a subject for another day. But what matters for the convergence we have been tracking across the last 40 minutes is this. Science has mapped the treadmill. The Buddha mapped the exit. Act 4, Landing. So let us stand back at the end and see what we have walked through. The mountain of gold, SN 420, would not suffice. Even doubled, even offered by Mara in the name of righteous kingship. The Buddha refused because acquisition, he understood, is a bond even when what you acquire is the power to help. The lottery winners, the 22 people in a 1978 study, and the many thousands tracked across decades since, adapted, not completely, not immediately, but enough that the things they had spent their lives working toward lost their ability to move them, and they were already reaching for what was next. The nations got richer, and average happiness barely moved. Each dollar bought less than the one before, and above a certain level, money stopped fixing the deepest sources of human misery because it was never going to reach them in the first place. The leper, MN75, sat close to the charcoal pit, scratched his sores with his fingernails. The fire felt good. The scratching felt good. Each action deepened the wound, and his impaired senses registered the damage as relief. The dopamine system kept firing. The wanting system, vast and robust, kept running ahead of the liking system. The cubic millimeter hotspots delivered brief, fragile pleasure. The counterpressure grew with use. The treadmill ran faster, and all of it, the gold, the lottery, the fire, the dopamine, is pointing at one thing: taṇhā, SN 5611, the thirst that runs on passion and delight, that seeks its next object in one place and then another, that perpetuates further becoming. It does not resolve by getting what it wants. The architecture is not designed to resolve. It is designed to perpetuate. And the Buddha's answer, I want to say this clearly at the end, is not to want less. It is not to learn to settle. It is not to want better objects or more sophisticated experiences, or to work harder at being grateful for what you already have. It is not to suppress wanting. It is to see taṇhā so clearly, to see the leper's situation from the healed man's eyes, to see the scratch deepening the wound, to see the wanting that always outruns the having, that the grip loosens on its own. Dispassion arises not because we forced the craving down, but because we stopped feeding it, because we saw fully that what we were feeding on was chewing us up. This is the freedom the Buddha described. The freedom that the wanderer Magandhya, on first hearing of it, thought sounded like a disease. To lose the pull of what you used to call pleasure. To no longer be dragged toward the charcoal pit. To be, in the phrase that anchors the entire teaching, free from thirst, inwardly at peace. But the clear seeing this all rests on raises a question the Buddha was very careful about. Because if taṇhā is the craving that runs the system, then who is doing the craving? Who is running on the treadmill? Who is scratching the sores? Who is the leper? And who is the healed man? You have an answer to that. You have had it since you were a child. There is someone in here, a self, an I, the one who wants, the one who suffers, the one, you hope, who might one day be free. Modern neuroscience has spent decades looking for that self inside the brain, scanning, cutting, measuring, imaging, running split-brain patients through clever experiments, mapping the default mode network. Philosophers of mind have spent the same decades trying to say what consciousness actually is and where the self actually sits. And the results are, if you have not heard them before, unsettling. The brain does not seem to contain a central self. It does not seem to contain a command center. It does not seem to contain a single, continuous, permanent entity that matches what we mean when we say I. Not no one, but no thing, nothing stable, nothing fixed, nothing that can bear the weight of what the word normally carries. The Buddha asked this exact question 25 centuries before the first brain scanner existed, and he gave an answer that, if you hear it carelessly, sounds like modern neuroscience's conclusion. There is no self, but his actual teaching was more precise than that, more careful, and, it will turn out, more useful. Because the Buddha did not give you a metaphysical claim. He gave you a tool. What the tool is, and what it is actually for, and why it matters more than anything we have walked through today. That is where we go next. The Meeting Point, Episode 5. Who is there? See you there.